Okay, there's the official warning. Yeah, can you, for the sake of the recording and the transcript, can you tell me your name and a little bit about your background, and yeah, we'll take it from there.
Okay, great. Yeah, my name is Austin Ringelstein, and gosh, my background it's so bizarre that
You're bumping around a little with it looks like it's a laptop in your lap or something where you move and it moves. Kind of.
okay. Yeah, it was just
on solid ground there somehow.
yeah, I have it on a pillow, so I'm kind of bouncing up and down here.
Okay.
But yeah, let me know if it becomes a
Don't
problem.
bounce.
I'll sit still here.
Okay.
Well, anyway, I have kind of an unusual background because I started off when I was 18 in the United States Navy and joined before 9/11, and kind of had aims to do what I thought were going to be more peacekeeping missions. And it was actually a relatively peaceful time in U.S. history, which I think is kind of hard to find. But there was a window where we didn't have any major wars or campaigns going on, although there were conflicts. But then when I was actually at the United States Naval Academy, and kind of as this plucky, doughy-eyed, naive guy in a way. But I ended up 9/11 happened, and instead of becoming a Navy salvage diver, which I wanted to do, I ended up going down the pipeline into the Navy bomb squad. So long story short, that resulted in a combat deployment to Iraq, where I led a platoon disposing of ordnance. And I ended up getting coming down with an autoimmune condition shortly thereafter, which got me out of the Navy. And then I went into archaeology, and sort of had a renewal of my spirit at that point, because I sort of rediscovered myself through archaeology. But really, it was connecting with indigenous culture through indigenous material culture that really resonated with me. So I found this pathway into archaeology, which led to doing work at a federal level. And I think that's where I'm circling back to your question about the process. So I ended up working with the National Park. I ended up interning with the National Park Service in 2013 to learn the ropes of archaeology and working with communities, and ended up getting a job with the National Park Service, which became a full-time job once I got my master's degree in archaeology, and sort of worked up the ranks, so to speak. They call them GS levels in the National Park Service and the Department of the Interior. But I ended up the last 3 years becoming the park archaeologist in the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. So I was sort of thrown into what's called Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, that's the main federal policy that guides archaeology and archaeological compliance when it comes to federal undertakings. And basically, whenever you have a federal undertaking, which could be any action that could result in impacts to archaeological resources or cultural resources, or any undertaking that is funded by the US government, you have to do an archaeological assessment to consider the impacts that undertaking might have on cultural resources. And the key word there is that these agencies have to consider the impacts, which unfortunately doesn't give a lot of teeth to the law, but it does at least mandate that an archaeological assessment is done. And it really has to be a good faith effort to survey an entire area, which is known as an area of potential effect, where the project might impact resources. That reasonable and good faith effort, is really kind of all dependent on who's doing it. But luckily, the consultation process allows for checks and balances to make sure that a good job is done. And that checks and balances process means that archaeologists are constantly working with the stakeholders, which in most cases are tribes, as well as the state historic preservation offices. So really, anytime there's a federal undertaking, you're gonna do a pedestrian intensive survey of of the area of potential effect, and then produce a report of your findings. And then the last step is consulting with the stakeholders as well as the State Historic Preservation Office to determine what the potential impacts of the undertaking, what the potential impacts of the undertaking might be. And you're really trying to determine if there's going to be adverse effects to potentially significant cultural resources. And I'll pause there and see if you have any further questions.
Well, those are all processes that I'm a little familiar with and would expect. And as you say, the idea of a good faith effort, I guess, applies to what level of diligence is applied, but also, how much time they have and how much pressure they're under, as we were discussing. And, I think I was surprised by Thacker Pass, the quick permitting under the Mining Act, the fast tracking. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I of course have worked in the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area, but just having examined the EIS from Thacker Pass and reading some of the materials that have come out about Thacker Pass, there seems to be a consensus that the project was fast tracked. And when you fast track a project like that, especially with that scope, I saw something like 18,000 acres, which would be, more or less the area of potential effect, right? Because you have to take into account direct effects of the project, of the proposed project, indirect effects, and cumulative effects. So they really, they probably did a good job of looking at the entire area that could be impacted. However, fast tracking a project from an archaeological perspective, you have to wonder, can you actually do a reasonable, good faith effort when you have a condensed timeline? And when it comes especially to consultation, that's antithetical to that process and the directives that are out there. Like the Department of the Interior, have put out directives and policy regarding consultation, which say that you need to do consultation early and often, and that, time is your ally. That's more of an indigenous perspective that, it's more of an indigenous perspective than an existing capitalist perspective that, we need to take time to build relationships and also to make sure that people can reach a consensus. When you fast track a project, you don't allow for that space for proper communication for archaeological sites to be interpreted, for tribes to actually gather themselves and be able to speak about the value and significance of their resources, and to even to know what they're working with. And really, the larger the scope of a project, the greater amount of time should be allotted to that process. So there's no doubt that fast tracking a project because of a so-called deadline creates disharmony and is actually antithetical to the spirit of Section 106 and the cultural resources laws that we're guided by under federal law.
Well, we're in the middle of this enormous push and pressure in industry and government for green energy solutions. And one of those is lithium for EV batteries for electric cars, the electrification of the transport system globally in response to climate change. And then all of that pressure is brought down. I mean, it seems like 18,000 acres is a lot, but really, you know, when you're looking at, you know, a situation where we might say the whole world is watching, that 18,000 acres becomes extremely important, you know, on that level. And the pressure gets extremely high. So what do you think happened at Thacker Pass that was creating disharmony, and why is there a gap between the statements from Doris, Sam, and others that you saw in the video and the process that they described, where they say, for example, Dean Barisi says, no one talked to us. No one came and talked to us. And Doris says, well, it was a massacre site, so we know that they got surprised and all their living, you know, utensils and tools and hunting gear, you know, is out there, not to mention the bones that sink into the earth, you know, over time, not having been buried, nothing having been buried in 2 massacres. I mean, it seems like an extreme situation.
Well, in my opinion, it does. And I would agree with that. Again, the larger the scope of a federal undertaking, the greater the amount of consultation and due diligence to meet with the stakeholders and to come to some kind of consensus there is. And when you have 18,000 acres and over 1,000 recorded archaeological sites, this is a massive undertaking. So the fact that 3 letters were sent to 3 tribal groups, and there doesn't seem to be much evidence of follow-up to actually reach those folks, is, in my opinion, an abysmal attempt at consultation. And really, the buzzword here is meaningful consultation. And of course, that can be defined differently by different people, but there has been policy and guidance put out that when you can, you want to meet with tribal members face to face. You want to have really good listening sessions in terms of hearing the tribes to be able to understand what their perspective is and understand what values they assign to different resources. So saying that we sent letters out and didn't hear back during a pandemic and during a fast track timeline is certainly not a good faith effort to have meaningful consultation. And I don't know the nuances or details of that process, but there hasn't been evidence to the contrary that there was meaningful consultation ever done. The very fact that numerous amounts of tribal members, especially elders, have issues with this project in terms of their sacred sites and their archaeology, and the fact that they have assigned values to Thacker Pass that are incredibly culturally significant, means that there is a conflict that hasn't had any kind of resolve. When I look at it from an objective Section 106 standpoint too, you have over 50 significant National Register eligible sites. In fact, that was only in the direct impact area.
Can you stop and say that again? Because we had just a little bit of breakup, but
Okay.
where you started, you have over 50?
Yeah, you have over 50 National Register eligible significant archaeological sites within the direct impact area, and then an additional 30 plus sites in the indirect impact area that are National Register eligible. From a Section 106 standpoint, from more of an objective, standpoint, that alone right there is evidence of an incredible amount of impact, adverse effect that's going to happen to this place. And the bottom line is that was very minimally addressed in the EIS. There hasn't been any viable pathway for mitigation spelled out within the EIS that would, in some meaningful way, avoid these sites, or let me say it another way. The goal of mitigation is usually minimization and avoidance. And in this case, there hasn't really been any. I'm sorry, I'm slipping up a little bit here. Let me just
take a minute. Take a minute.
Gather myself real quick.
Too, so I'm cool. I'm happy. It's still warm.
Okay. Yeah, I probably just need to take a drink of water. I guess this can be edited, right? So I don't need to like.
Oh yeah, totally.
Say the perfect thing.
I'll tell you if it's messed up, and then you can do it again, basically, or you can tell me either way.
Okay.
Just covered a little bit of breakup there by having you do it twice. So I'll take a word from one take and plug it into take one, that kind of thing.
Okay. I think what I want to do is just put this document in front of me so that I can reference it better without having to guess what I'm saying.
Okay.
So I'm just going to take a minute here to put it up. Let's see. I just got to remember where it was.
Well, I think a lot of people in the public are unaware of all of this, and when you look at it from their point of view, it's not unlike my point of view when I started the film, Who Are My People?
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that no consultation had taken place. And I mentioned, the no meaningful consultation. And I mentioned the Kokopili geoglyph, which I can share with you, which is like truly amazing. The project applicant said, oh, it's only, I don't know what they said. It was something like 7 years old or something like that. And all of those geoglyphs were dated by an anthropologist named J. von Werloff, at dating back to maybe 300 AD, that kind of thing. And the general consensus of tribes is they're not even getting at the real time depth. So we had this disinformation campaign going on, and really, I was very new to everything. So I thought, well, how do I make a film like this, right? And
Yeah.
so I tagged on to failure to consult as kind of the operating principle, and followed the results of that on the ground. I mean, there was harassment during construction, there was destruction of ancient geoglyphs, there was the misrepresentation and misinformation by the project applicant and then the BLM. So I covered it all back because I could just see it made no sense. You know, when I went out there and I looked at the geoglyph and where the patina meets the where the rocks, you know, meet the caliche, you know, and you sort of look at the little rise and how, you know, whether it looks like it's been buried in there or it's rather recent. I mean, there's really no difference between that geoglyph and any other geoglyph that I could tell. So, you know, that was just my layman's thought, you know, and I think when you go back to other lay people, you know, in the public, they don't understand those controversies.
Yeah, and definitely. And I mean, I can articulate a few things here that I wrote down, maybe a little better than how I said it. Are you still recording?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of, you know, your earlier question about these sites in terms of or Thacker Pass in terms of fast tracking the project, um, and consultation and how that all played out in such a condensed timeline. You know, one thing that I made note of was that they may have potentially met the minimum standards for Section 106, but they certainly failed to do meaningful consultation to assess the value of cultural resources to existing indigenous people. And the guidance by the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation, who should have an opportunity to comment about this project, is that consultation should be carried out in a manner appropriate to the scale of the undertaking and the scope of the federal involvement. So when you have a project this large, the consultation process should be done in a really thorough and thoughtful manner. I mean, I've looked at projects that I've done with the National Park Service, and our level of consultation was greater than this project for a small site and a very small undertaking. So it's actually quite stunning to me to see the lack of consultation and the lack of meaningful engagement with the tribes in this process. And the one thing that I really honed in on is that really there seems to be a gap between sites that were identified as being significant and then the value of those sites to the living communities and cultural descendants. And my question, you know, would be is, you know, why isn't the BLM taking inventory of the value of the site to those living communities and cultural descendants? Because even built within Section 106, the National Historic Preservation Act, a site's significance and the values that it may exhibit and the value to that tribe or to that stakeholder really should be in line with one another. So, especially when it comes to burials, and we have a massacre site here, the special nature of burials are widely recognized in law and practice as having special qualities. They also possess a value to living groups that extend beyond the interests of archaeological research. So why is it that we're, you know, within this archaeological assessment, why isn't there more time and effort being devoted to the value of this place in terms of it being a massacre site and having, you know, people's ancestors literally either buried there or unfortunately scattered throughout that valley? I'll take a pause there. I might need your help because I'm fumbling with my words a little bit.
Yeah, no, it's sounding good, and I understand. Well, you know, Will in the video made the analogy to Gettysburg.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've heard the phrase national patrimony. So aside from this dichotomy of tribal versus non-tribal awareness and values assigned, from the standpoint of the country,
Mhm.
and what we learn and who we are and where our historical reckonings, arise from, let's say. I thought that analogy was really good. And also his discussion of the mapping of the site overall, the battle. It was systemic. Where did Robert E. Lee sit on his horse and watch the action? Where did the troops approach from? Where did they fall? And then translating that into the Thacker Pass site. Okay, you've got people running with, a couple of bullets in them. Where do they fall? Those kinds of analyses.
Absolutely.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, actually, Will did a really good job of spelling that out. And what he's getting at there in terms of cultural resource law is that this is actually a designated historic district, and that means that in addition to the somewhat not disparate but separate archaeological sites that were recorded, there's one cohesive unit that's been recorded as a historic district, which in itself is eligible to the National Register of Historic Places. And as a historic district, there's a holistic understanding of its significance. And part of the problem with an undertaking within a historic district is that you can potentially adversely affect one part of the district, which then destroys the integrity of most or the entire place. And it's been acknowledged in the environmental impact statement that the historic district would be adversely affected by these actions. I can actually go to that section if you'd like, and tell you about
Sure.
that.
Sure.
So there were over 1,000 archaeological sites. It looks like 1,020. In a general sense, they're called cultural resources sites. And there is a component of a large cultural district, the Thacker Pass component of the Double H Whitehorse Obsidian Procurement District. Sort of in layperson's terms, this is a major site for, or major, I should say, location or locale for stone tool sourcing and stone tool processing. And in this case, the stone that they're using is obsidian. Now, BLM, the archaeologists working for BLM made it clear that most of the over 1,000 archaeological sites or cultural resources sites are what are called lithic scatters, with obsidian toolstone assay and reduction sites within the Thacker Pass component. And what that means is that most of the archaeological sites appear to be areas where people were doing stone tool processing, making arrowheads, making scrapers, and other items that indigenous people were using for usually processing food, but they could also be ceremonial in nature. They could be have multiple meanings. it's important to point out also that there were grinding implements and other indicators of a broader range of activities that were taking place. They were a little bit vague in describing that here. But I looked into it a little further, and the grinding implements and the other indicators of a broader range of activities actually means that there is some habitation sites that they found. When it comes to this historic district, I'm going to scroll down to the bottom here where they talk about potential impacts.
Can you adjust your camera just a little bit? You got a lot of headroom. There
Okay.
you go. That's better.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna read what it says in terms of the proposed actions under alternative A.
Okay.
The surface effects in the mining area and exploration plan area would adversely affect all 56 historic properties eligible under criterion D due to the loss of integrity and data from ground disturbances, altering artifact and feature assemblages, temporarily sensitive remains, and the depositional environment of the local landform. And in the case of obsidian quarrying locales, connection to large-scale prehistoric land use patterns within the Thacker Pass component of the DHWOPD, which is the historic district. Historic properties also eligible under criterion A, specifically the CCC remnants, would suffer the same integrity and data loss.
That's an interesting way of saying they're going to dig a 4,000-foot deep pit.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sort of like, you know, we don't want to run the truck over that, you know, kind of writing, you know, and really, you know, they're just taking out the whole valley, at least that half of it looks like.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm getting at here is that, you know, I'm not at all critical of these statements here because they're just true. There's actually admission here that the project, that huge pit that you just referenced, is going to adversely affect 56 historic properties that are National Register eligible. So the question here is, what are they going to do about it? And the answer that they give is incredibly vague. The mitigation for effects from the proposed action is the implementation of an approved historic properties treatment plan, in other words, an HPTP, which is currently in development. So my question is, what exactly is going to be implemented to mitigate the effects on these 56 significant sites? That's a question I can't answer without actually speaking with the archaeologists and BLM.
What if there's no mitigation possible?
Well, that's a great question. It's a really good question, Robert, because mitigation is already a tricky word to begin with, because, you know, I took Latin, and it comes from the Latin mitigo, mitigare, mitigavi, mitigatus, which means, in essence, to lessen or decrease. So what you're getting at here is to lessen or decrease an impact. But the bottom line is there's still an impact, right? No matter what you offset or decrease. How big did you say the open pit mine is?
I think it's thousands of feet deep.
So if you have a 1,000-foot deep mine, you know, I think, how many acres is it? Thousands of acres. You're having one of the largest impacts to an area that I can conceive of. And so mitigating something like that, it's almost inconceivable to understand how you mitigate it. In archaeological terms, what it might mean is, you know, monitoring and watching things either get destroyed or removed. And that's usually called a salvage effort. But salvaging and mitigating are a little bit different, right? Because how meaningful is your mitigation if you're just removing sensitive items and putting them in a different place? Holistically, when it comes to an archaeological district, if you lose the setting and feel of that place, that's a loss of integrity. There's 7 aspects of integrity that are analyzed in section 106. And within those seven aspects, you have setting, feeling. Those are just 2 of the 7, but those are the 2 that come straight to my mind that would actually be compromised by having an open pit mine there, because you lose the original feeling and the original look, the original cultural value of a place that has incredible biota and incredible cultural resources.
Right. Well, it reminds me of when they built the Ivanpah solar power tower. And some of the statements that came from that time period, and I don't recall exactly whether they're attributed to Sierra Club or BLM or those kinds of things, but in question was tortoise habitat. And tortoise are protected. And this is an area that's primary tortoise habitat. It's also a habitation site. And the response that I heard, or the statements that I heard, were things like, we're going to make more tortoise habitat. That was a quote, and it prompts jokes, like, I thought only God could make more tortoise habitat, things like that, but that's nonetheless what they said. And it meant moving tortoise. And when they moved tortoise at Fort Irwin Army Base down there in the desert, they had a 50% kill rate. So this idea of mitigation, seems to be in the eye of the beholder. I mean, who benefits and who wants what and what you can say and get away with. Am I right there, or am I just cynical?
Well, I think that, I working in the field I've worked in, mitigation is appropriate at certain times. If you, for example, in the National Park Service, the bottom line is we have trails, and we, there are people that want to go out and enjoy trails, and they happen to sometimes intersect with archaeological sites. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that you throw out the baby with the bathwater and get rid of all the trails. Otherwise, people actually wouldn't even have access to learn about cultural heritage or learn about the beauty of nature and resonate with all that's out there. So yeah, sometimes mitigation is totally appropriate. We're gonna make this trail smaller, or make sure that when we trim, that when we do some vegetation trimming in this area, that we do it with a monitor, and that we do it in a really careful and thoughtful way. And that can be good mitigation. But when it comes to a large scale project like this, and you're talking about mitigation offsets, such as removing tortoises, desert tortoises to another area, or preserving one area so that you could destroy another. Personally, and I know there's various opinions out there, I see that as problematic, because it's another way of kicking the can down the road. And if you already have an area that's been assigned significance and value, and we're talking over 1,000 archaeological sites, over 50 of which have been determined to be significant under section 106, the National Historic Preservation Act, or as most people understand it, eligible to the National Register of Historic Places. And we have a major area which we know had a massacre occur in 1865, which is significant, in my opinion, and many others, to the history of the United States, especially in terms of the history of the Indian Wars, the so-called Indian Wars, and in terms of the development of the West. And I'm not saying that that was necessarily a good thing, but something that we can learn from. If we destroy these areas and then say, well, we're mitigating it because we're going to create something else somewhere else, then what are we really doing here? Are we really actually protecting our heritage? Or are we just, destroying one place and saving another until there's nothing left? How do we reconcile kicking the can down the road when we're starting to run out of land to protect? So I've seen this too often where we call it mitigation, but really we can't avoid the elephant in the room, that there's actually destruction. There's actually loss, cultural loss. And I think one thing that really gets left out of these situations that we need to remember is that there's significant human emotion involved with these types of things. So, on paper, mitigation might look good at an agency level, but what do you say to the elders who, are crying over the loss of their ancestors and have to mourn, maybe a second death because, we want lithium that bad, and we're not actually thinking about how we're doing this, There's no denying that climate change is real and that we have an issue that we need to take care of in terms of the future generations and making sure that we can actually live on this planet. But if we're doing that at the expense of current communities and hurting the communities that are in these lands where mineral extraction is taking place, then is that really doing our due diligence to help out future generations, or are we just creating destruction in another sense?
Well, at Thacker Pass, we're talking to direct descendants of the last survivor of the second massacre. So their connection, via family and via family stories and via, how things worked and how people live is really strong. And it's not necessarily dead when they're talking about the presence of food sources on the land and the presence of medicinal herbs on the land, and then the connections there with ceremony and religious ceremony and prayer and practice. I mean, what I was hearing is they'd like to continue the use of that land in the way that it's always been used by them, and they can't. And there was that comment about, oh, well, we used to pray at this certain area by I want to call it, I forgot the name, what they call it, Sentinel Rock. They actually call it Nipple Rock, because it looks like a nipple. But there's an area there where they pray that's now gated and they can't get in there. That's a BLM decision. That's a federal decision. You're locked out. Was that appropriate? And is that a good example of cultural loss in the present day to present day peoples?
Yeah, and I hope it's not a loss, a permanent loss. And I imagine that, if this fight continues, that there can be a victory in the sense of reclaiming these areas. Really what I'm observing is that federal law, especially cultural resource law, is behind the paradigm shifts that have happened in archaeology and academia when it comes to honoring indigenous people and collaborating with indigenous communities. The paradigm shift that's happened in archaeology is recognizing that we're not just doing archaeology to only examine the past or interrogate the past, but we're doing it to call attention to what's in the present and connecting the past, present, and future. And there's numerous, I'm not the first to say this, there's numerous indigenous scholars who are really leading that effort, such as Dr. Sim Schneider at Santa Cruz and Dr. Sonia Adelaide in Massachusetts, who's Ojibwe. Archaeology can be a wonderful tool for actually vivifying, helping to revive and renew these relationships with the earth and reconnecting with these places. So at Thacker Pass, I think that what we see here is an archaeological process happening that's beholden to an outdated system and an outdated process that's constrained by time and constrained by the motives of capitalism to put profits and extraction over the needs of the people and over the wishes of the people and over the desires to reconnect with their ancestors and their spirituality. And maybe it's not even just reconnecting, there's a continuity there, right? There's a really great subfield in archaeology called the archaeologies of persistence. And it's showing that, a lot of these places and objects and sacred items, whereas in the past they were determined to be, remnants of acculturation. Like if you have a glass bead mixed in with shell beads, then it's a sign that there was some kind of cultural loss and that it was less indigenous or less Native American than it was before. But on the contrary, what a glass bead can show is actually continuity and persistence, because it shows that people were adopting non-local materials into their existing traditions. And I imagine that at Thacker Pass, you have an incredible amount of continuity of practices, people continuing to gather there, people continuing to pray there over the centuries. And that story needs to be told and accounted for as part of its cultural significance. It would be, in fact, I think beneficial to the BLM and other agencies for these stories to be told. Why not make Thacker Pass not just a cultural district, but maybe a cultural historic site like Sand Creek? Now that's not something I would determine. That would be determined through consensus, but and the tribes would be the ones to determine that. But why not think about the infinite possibilities of a historically and culturally significant place rather than thinking of it as an object of abstraction?
Something in the way
Something in the way, yeah.
of a grander ambition. I was going to point out what we could call hypocrisy, so societally, but I'd rather use the word disconnect because I think the reason that it's so important to mine lithium in the eyes of not only industry, but our policymakers is so that we can live in better balance with our numbers and with our machines and with our carbon dioxide releases and so on. We can live in better balance very simply with the earth, and yet here you have this historic district and this historic people still there who would like to live in balance with the earth, and they're all too happy to share their history, and their values and their beliefs and their understanding of why this could be done differently or better or not at all. So I feel like I've got an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other shoulder, or if you will.
Yeah. So I think what you're getting at is that there's sort of this aspiration by our society to want to reach our goals in terms of climate change and live in balance and so-called harmony with the earth. And here we are, trying to attain that using this ends justifies means approach. Like, we're going to extract lithium so that we can reach this goal by 2050 of being carbon neutral. And yet we're not listening to the very people who are indigenous to this land, who are in accord with the land and who are in accord with these values that promote balance and harmonious living, not in some stereotypical sense, but in a real sense. These are indigenous people who have a better understanding of the land and its resources and its value, spiritually, holistically, than anyone could concoct, sitting at some conference. So who should we be listening to, right?
Well, you hear the phrase "the first environmentalists," and it's kind of corny, in a way, the way it's used sometimes. But then, in my experience of just coming to know people, I would say, well, depending on your definitions of this word or that word in English, I mean, it's certainly true. They had to be.
I mean, absolutely. 20,000 to 30,000 years ago, their ancestors arrived here on this continent, maybe even earlier. And if you can imagine that amount of time adapting to this environment, relating to it, preying on the land, the blood, the tears, the sweat are all in the soil here of their ancestors. I can't think of better people to understand how to steward these lands. It's just a no-brainer in some ways. It's they had to adapt to it, and there's scientific and archaeological information that indicates that the indigenous people of this land adapted to numerous climate changes, adapted to numerous disasters, natural disasters, adapted to violent clashes and the onset of colonialism, and they're still here. So who should we listen to when it comes to climate solutions? Well, I would say the ones who have been here and who have gone through the most changes and adaptations and have really had to figure it out. There's more than we know, and I'm not going to claim to even know these answers or even know a pathway forward, but making a space where we can all listen, and that really starts with placemaking. If we don't allow these places to exist, then we're shooting ourselves in the foot. The way I look at Thacker Pass and that huge valley with numerous sages, and I'm not as familiar with the types of plants that are there, but numerous medicines and sage grouse and desert tortoises, and among many other animals. I'm looking at a place that is full of medicine for the future, not just in terms of not even just the plants and the animals, but as a spiritual place. If we destroy the altars that give us a place to pray and actually convene and figure things out, then all that we're going to be left with is strip malls and strip mines.
Right, a kind of manufactured version of humanity on Earth, rather
Absolutely.
than one that developed organically, based on human strength. You know, you talked about surviving all those years and everything. I mean, the other project that I mentioned where we were telling the story, you know, of the population of the Americas. I mean, there was oral history among the Heidtstock people in Canada and British Columbia that references the extent of the glacial maximum and the density of ice along the coast. And they referred to a specific island where tribal people gathered 15,000 years ago because it was ice free. And that's oral history, right? And I say, because I'm trying to be simple sometimes, I'm saying they remembered. And it corresponded exactly to the dates of the science relative to the progression of ice actually well before the last ice age ended.
Mm-hmm.
And you push back the dates, you know, you can push back the dates farther depending on what you're, you know, what remains you're looking at. And there are older remains. But that's quite stunning, you know, that the oral history would be able to merge, you know, over a 15,000 year time frame passing, you know, and basically tell the same story and corroborate one another.
And it just goes to show that the marriage of oral history and science can be very powerful. And it's a great word to use, you know, corroborating. It's just like what we learn in school, you know. When I did a master's program in education at UC Santa Cruz, you know, my professor who was teaching social studies education and pedagogy, you know, she was saying, you know, teach your students to corroborate their sources. The more powerful, you know, your argument's only as powerful as your corroborating evidence, right? So, you know, one thing in archaeology that I tell the students who I teach in grad school is multiple lines of evidence, when it's all braided together, it creates a stronger rope or a stronger basket, therefore your argument's going to be that much stronger when you can merge oral histories, when you can merge ethnographic information, hard science. All of it has a place. You know, when you have DNA information that corroborates with an oral tradition from a tribe, then wow, there you go. And that's why, you know, I don't see this as a Thacker Pass or Standing Rock. I don't see these tensions between, you know, government agencies and law enforcement and tribes and activists as necessarily disparate. I think we can come together in ways that we're just not. We haven't manifested the fullness of our possibility yet. You know, science and oral history can come together. Archaeology and communities can come together. Federal agencies can come together, you know, with communities. It's just making sure that these relationships don't have some kind of hierarchical structure or power hierarchy. So
they're not obligated to a certain result for a certain economic reason.
Correct. And that's exactly what I think is wrong with the process. You know, what's an environmental impact statement if you actually don't have equal power players in terms of, you know, having a seat at the table? If the tribes aren't going to be listened to during consultation, then, you know, it's sort of like, well, why are we here if you're not going to give us if you're not going to actually listen to what we're saying? And the good news is I've seen examples where that actually does happen, where people are listened to, and there's usually better outcomes when you can get those win-win-win situations for everybody. And that's really, and actually, that's the guidance that's out there. Um, Reaching a consensus is actually within um, Secretary Holland's guidance, policy guidance uh, for the BLM. You know, there was a recent directive that she put out which outlines reaching consensus. So, you know, I don't think that someone like Secretary Holland is is not within the spirit of what we're discussing here. She's right there in there. Uh, I think the problem at this point is, how do you pick up the pieces after something has been fast tracked? But I don't think that this is something that we can't resolve. I think that there's still plenty of space for resolving this.
Well, you know, that's a great statement. And I actually think it's a great statement to end with. You know, because I just sort of tracing the road we went down through all these issues and everything. I wouldn't have expected that you would have said that. So I'm glad you did. Can you explain that just a little bit, you know, for a wrap up kind of
Yeah.
idea?
Yeah, well, I think that it's incredibly transformational to have an indigenous person in the seat of the Secretary of Interior. Uh, I mean, it goes without saying, but I will also unpack that a little bit. You know, as someone who has been interested in Native American history, indigenous history, and someone who also served, you know, I've served the federal government for close to 20 years in some capacity, whether it be in the Navy, then moving on to the National Park Service for close to 10 years. You know, I woke up to the idea that I woke up to the fact, I should say, that this country was really founded on principles of, you know, what's been described as unfettered capitalism and conspicuous consumption. And really, at the heart of that is extraction of resources. And it took me a while to really understand that. But, you know, reading those books, such as Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, In the Spirit of Crazy Horse, some of those classics within the canon of, you know, American or Native American literature, so to speak. You know, it doesn't take much to understand that the land grabs have mostly been about economic exploitation. And I really don't think that, you know, a group of elders or tribal communities making a stand at a place like Thacker Pass is really any kind of direct threat to anybody. But the threat is, you know, stopping mineral extraction. Because mineral extraction and resource extraction, whether it be uranium or oil or gold in the Black Hills, you know, that was Custer, right? That's been the main motivation for the stealing of indigenous lands. And most of that policy and the breaking of the treaties, which largely was the undercurrent of that policy, was guided by the United States Interior, right? And the Secretary of the Interior. So to have an indigenous person who actually has, you know, a good heart and a good mind for her people in charge of the Secretary of Interior, or in charge of all of the lands under the United States, um, is extraordinary. It's in some ways revolutionary, but I also think that what she's doing in that position is holding a space, um, which is somewhat paradoxical, but also there's a large potential for transformation. You know, we do need to exist as human beings on this continent, and there will be some form of, transportation that we probably need to have something that gets us to and from another place. Uh, but does it need to be based on mineral extraction to this extent? Does it need to be oil? Does it need to be lithium? Can we build more sustainable cities? Can we think of a future and envision a future that doesn't have this much amount of consumption and waste? And anyway, I think that having somebody who is indigenous in that seat creates a lot more possibility for a future that is transcendent and different than what we have, than the trajectory that we're on. So, I hope I hope that we can think of that kind of in a positive light, that, this person comes from a tradition of living in accord with their environment. And maybe that in itself is going to be the bridge to our future. And it might not look the same as it did in the 1700s, but it might be something new and completely unified with all the changes that have been occurring. So anyway, I'm hopeful for the future, and I think that someone like Secretary Holland has the potential to really help and transform. It's a matter of making sure that we all come together, right? Because the more momentum that we have and unity that we have, like we did at Standing Rock, the more we'll actually be able to enact change and kind of knock down the door. It really needs to come from the people and not just one individual. Thank you for letting me speak so much.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I let you roll with it because obviously you know what you're talking about, and one connects to another, and it makes sense in your perspective. And yeah, really thank you. I kind of have to get up and stretch a little bit, and I think we got a lot, you know.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah,
and
I'm sorry I wasn't as like articulate as I could be. I struggle a little bit with my energy sometimes.
mhm.
But I'm sure that after this I'll think of all the things I could have said.
Well, I listen like an editor. I mean,
Okay.
you mentioned listening, and I think that was a very pertinent thing to say, because as I proceeded with this career and this idea in filmmaking, I've been in a lot of different aspects of that, and corporate and non-corporate and entertainment and commercial and this and that and writing and everything. But really the basis of it that's important to me at this point is listening, and helping people understand that listening is a pretty good idea. you know Deep
Yeah,
listening is a word that people use there that's real good.
absolutely. Yeah, I should have
Mhm.
said deep listening. Yeah, I that's definitely key. And that actually comes from indigenous people. I sat, I mean, it's a human trait, right? It doesn't have to be just from indigenous people, but I sat in a National Park Service sanctioned session on tribal consultation led by indigenous people who are in the National Park Service. And they had a whole session on deep listening during consultation. How there's basically three different types of listening. There's the listening where, you know, you're distracted, then there's listening where you're kind of like hearing what someone's saying, but having like still some stuff running in the background. And then there's deep listening where you are truly shutting everything else off and allowing for all of that sort of meditative thought and concentration and focus coming into you. And that's the kind of listening that needs to take place during these consultations and anytime we get together. Maybe I'm not practicing what I'm preaching because I'm talking right now. But anyway, I'm with you there.
Beautiful.
Hey,
Yeah, it's amazing what we have in our brains. And what I feel sometimes when I'm doing an interview like this one, or something else, could be a troubled person, whatever. I mean, I feel like there's times where I stop and pause and check myself, and my internal voice says something like, what are you hearing? What are you really hearing? Right. And then sometimes after I do one of these interviews, I'll like lie down for a little bit, and kind of just like let thoughts flow over me, because we're so tuned into our own little structures, mental structures of, I believe this person, I don't believe this thing, I don't, there's just a lot of cross current, I mean, if you watch television or pay attention to politics, it's just like all cross current. It's all aggressive, that kind of thing. And so it's different to be able to say, I think I heard ... If I think about it a little bit, was that really an accurate assessment? Or was there something else emotionally going on? Or was there a nuance that I missed? Those kinds of things.
Yep. Yeah, I'm with you, and I think cross current's a great way to word it. It's there's always so much running in the background, and I'm really trying to pay attention to like how I just get through a day, with all the disparate thoughts and then taking into account what these screens and what our phones do to us, right? But yeah, gosh, do you have you seem to be a really good listener and in tune. Are you do you meditate? Do things like that? Do you have a practice?
Yeah, loosely. I mean, I've been doing it all my life, really. I mean, I told you about Joseph Campbell being a part of my early teenage upbringing, and Alan Watts, as well, more on the spiritual side of, being consciously aware of detail, and of detail that affect me and everything. And then I'll drop it for a while, I'll come back to it. Like now I will meditate and say prayers before I go to bed, that kind of thing. It's like I'm 4 years old.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Except I say them to Creator, I don't really say them to, a white man with long hair and a beard in the sky necessarily.
Right, right. Yeah. I know I'm with you, and I'm coming full circle in that way too. One thing that I didn't really find a space for in this discussion was I was thinking a lot about Myron Dewey. Do you know Myron Dewey?
Yes.
And I don't know if there's a space for it, but I wanted to sort of at least honor him and all of his work, because he's been on my mind a lot, and I felt pretty inspired to even delve into these subjects largely because of his work, and thinking about how dedicated he was to his people, and through media, through this type of work that you're doing, and getting ahead of the narrative was something that he always talked about. Making sure that that the activists, that the indigenous people can control the narrative, that we don't let anyone else hijack it. And his words really rung true to me. And the one thing that he said to me before he passed on was that, he looked me square in the eye and he said, "How are you upholding your end of the treaties?" And that really challenged me to think about that a lot and try to understand, as a white man, what am I doing uh, on this land? And it's not like, we can be white saviors or try to fix it all or even operate from white guilt, but there is a responsibility. There's a responsibility to uphold those treaties that were broken and to uphold that trust responsibility on a federal level to the tribes. And, like you said, a huge part of that is the deep listening and yielding. And
Yeah, and speaking as a white man, it's my government. I live in the United States of America. Maybe I would rather we called it something else, or it was a different time, or maybe I wish I was Italian one day or something like that. But, that means that we theoretically, have a voice in our body politic as citizens of the United States of America. And I think that's real motivator for me. I don't want this country to go to hell and be a place where we regularly abridge basic human rights and make people suffer. And then we can say, well, they're brown and black people that are suffering. Well, of course they are, but there's other people that are suffering too, and we don't want I don't want anybody to suffer. I want our country to be a little more solid and helpful and supportive and diverse, diverse ideas, diverse ways of participating if we're going to participate in this kind of government. Maybe some tribal people don't want to, but that's their choice because of their treaties, and their history and so forth. So, but I don't have that choice because I've just got the United States.
mm-hmm.
And my dad fought in a bunch of wars and everything like that. I mean, poor guy. And we have our patriotic part of our family. I look at it mainly as being very unfortunate, that all of these wars happened and that my father was in D-Day and he came home a little broken in certain ways, a little PTSD kind of situation.
Probably a lot of PTSD. Yeah.
Yeah, he was on a ship. They offloaded the troops and they uploaded the bodies.
Oh, I mean,
I wouldn't have liked to have done that in LST. You know what an LST is?
Yeah, tank landing ship. Yeah, I mean, just being in that situation alone is traumatic. Just being present there, and yeah, I mean, I've I've looked at, in a way, like I had PTSD from serving in Iraq, and in a way, it's like, yeah, well, how can I turn this into something useful? And I think what it does is it gives me this ability to sort of like walk in two different worlds. Like I came from a world that was, this military world, and then have found my way into another world that uh, where I'm just really excited to work with people who care about the planet, indigenous communities, the archaeology and all that. It's it's actually exciting because having seen the other side, it gives me a different perspective, so like
More open and loving. I mean, tribal communities are pretty loving. They're supportive of one another and the family and even others and extended family and acceptance, that kind of thing. And I don't think that was really part of the military command and control infrastructure.
oh, definitely. I mean, it's incredible. Like you were at Standing Rock, just, and I'm talking about like Ocheti Shakoan camp, not just the reservation, but,
Right.
being at the camp and just like, yeah, there are, of course, there's problems everywhere, but gosh, the amount of generosity, um, and kindness that came from people who have the least, resources in terms of like federal aid and, you know, material, you know, uh, material items, right? It's like
Yeah, material welfare.
material welfare is what I'm trying to say. Yeah. So people who would just be so generous to give you just kind words, or, you know, I thought I was coming there to help, and most time people were helping me. But there was something beautiful in that, because then there's like a sharing and an understanding and a growth that takes place, and transformation, so to speak.
Well, I mean, that's why I do it. So my dad was in, Normandy, Salerno. What was the invasion of Italy,
Oh yeah.
I mean, there's, and then Tripoli. Was that 3 or 4? And he came back, he had a beautiful hat, and, we played Navy in the living room. Someone would give an order and someone would salute, and I was like 4, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
He brought a lot home, and it brought a lot of stress to the family. It brought a lot of stress to me. The Vietnam War came about, and I was draftable. All the examples that I had were that, I could very well be sent to the jungle, against my will. My father told my brother, I'm not going to pay for your college education and your deferment unless you cut your hair. That was crazy.
Yeah.
So all that stress, and then the returning GIs, who definitely had, some issues and some drug challenges, and it was a very tumultuous time, and I never really recovered. I went into business and so forth, and that was just more stress and more of the same. And I did real well. I went on for a long time. But the reason that I made Unconquering the Last Frontier on the Elwha River was because I got into that because of ambition and career ambition and environmental ambition as much as anything. And then when I got there, I realized I was in a whole new world with a whole different community. I mean, people would laugh at me and say, oh, maybe you ought to put down that cell phone, I say, oh, yeah, maybe so. That was one of the first welcome to Indian countries that I got,
Yeah, that's good.
You're here, it's different. The cell phone, no, just put it away.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah,
So I've loved this experience, and it's really important to me. It's a really important part of my life, and I'm glad to hear it is as well for you, and that you get support and pleasure and all the things that we get out of it.
Yeah, and I think really what it is like, from I'm sure you can relate. It's sort of connecting with your spirit, and I didn't feel, I had never felt so spirited and uplifted as I did when I went to that camp in, Ocheti Shekon camp. And then,
can you start that again? Because my phone was ringing, and you said I've never felt so uplifted.
Yeah, I never felt so uplifted and spirited as I did when I went to Ocheti Shekon camp.
One more time, because I was talking over you.
Oh, that's okay.
So now you got the airtime. Action.
I never felt so spirited and uplifted as I did when I went to Ocheti Shekon camp, Standing Rock. And that's why I kept coming back. To participate in something where you're almost floating because it's just good and right, and you just know that the people around you are all in it for something more than, to make that kind of cliche quote, it's like bigger than themselves. But it really was, and it really is bigger than ourselves, all these things, because you're praying and going for something that's beyond the status quo reality that we're in, and seeing another reality. And I'm thinking about like John Trudell and some of the things he talks about, his that was made manifest there through those prayers.
Mhm.
And Myron Dewey was such a big part of that. And I was thinking about him a lot in terms of Thacker Pass because of, his cultural background and his affiliation, Paiute Shoshone, I believe. But I know I read also that his brother was inspired to really help out with this cause, which was nice to see. And I just thought of him a lot, and what role he would have been playing in all of this. And I hope that all of us can kind of carry that torch to some extent and do a good job, even if it's in real small ways. Just even, I remember him. He was such a good person, just like I had texted him at Ocheti Shekoan camp to deliver some t-shirts to water protectors, and months later, after the camp had actually come down, he texted me back and called me, and we talked for like 40 minutes. And he was just such a nice, kind person. He said, I'm following up because I saw your text and I wanted to make sure I, followed up with everybody to who I couldn't follow up with, at camp. And we ended up talking about, being a veteran and some of the things that he was doing. And then I ended up seeing him in the Black Hills. So I had, very little interaction with him, but anyway, I just wanted to bring him into this conversation because I thought it was important. And seeing my wife's calling me, so I should probably go.
Okay, well, we can pick it up or talk again and, check in on these things. And I'll get this material all together for you and try to get you a transcript as well, and a transcript of Will's stuff. So
Yeah.
just for everybody's benefit. And then we'll be, doing an article and probably some little podcast video.
Okay. Yeah. And I really appreciate this. I realized I wasn't very warmed up for a while talking, but even if you have to scrap all this, no worries. It's good. It's good just having the dialogue.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we can always record again or do what we want to do. So I'll just work with you and track her. I talked to her this morning. She was, good. She's prepared to go off to Missouri. And I put a call into Doris to make sure everybody was okay, because Tracker was saying, they're going to be arresting everybody. So I sent her a message. She said, "Is Josephine okay? Are you okay? Is Jimmy okay? Are you guys safe?" She said, "Yeah, I'm going to town. I'll call you." That might have been her calling me.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to
So
hear.
we'll all keep in touch, and
yeah, let's keep in touch. And overall, I just, I love hearing Will Falk talk, and you and the elders. And I'm just like, I'm really encouraged by this because it's helping me grow and try to put together all these things that I've learned over the years, or at least that I've experienced.
mhm.
But I hope that we continue to just have these dialogues and figure things out together. And I would just appreciate
Cool,
this.
brother.
Yeah, I appreciate this opportunity to learn too. So thank you so much.
Well, we always have to do something when there's a crisis, somehow. So it's usually how things start. It's like, oh my God, now what do we do? Like, not that the answers, but you're called somehow.
Definitely. And I hope that everyone stays safe. And if I can get up there with my wife and my son, or even solo, I'll see if there's a space for that.
Okay. Well, we'll talk again soon. So I'll let you know how things are going. If I hear any news from Tracker, I'll let you know.
Okay.
And we're on the thread with her, so she can always add something, or whatever the thread on Signal, she's on that. So.
Okay, great. Yeah, and last but not least, I want to make sure I don't disparage any archaeologists, because it's not the archaeologists I'm upset with. It's more so the process, So I'll just have to check that before we publish anything, I guess, right?
Well, there's no enemies here,
Yeah. Okay.
And those poor guys and women, it's like,
Yeah,
I know who they work for.
I do too. And that's the thing is, like, there's an ethical code, and I'm in the register of professional archaeologists. We're not supposed to like publicly, critique other archaeologists. So
Disparage.
yeah, but I hopefully I avoided that and just talked more about the hard
I
data.
didn't hear that.
Okay.
I'll check though.
Okay.
And then I'll run it by you. I'll send it to you before we publish anything.
Thank you.
Sure. Right on, man. Have a great day today.
Hey, you too, Robert. Thanks.
And what is your wife's name? Patrice?
Patrice.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, give her my best since I interrupted her day the other day, and say hello to your family, and thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you too. Thanks for
Okay.
listening.
Take care, man.
Okay. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.